Hello there. Kia ora. Hey, look, I'm not in the office at the moment. I mean, I technically am. I'm doing this on a green screen to make it look like I'm somewhere else, but I am actually somewhere else. I'm touring around the country at the moment because it's summer and I need a little bit of a break, but I've got a special effects budget to spend. So I'm going to do what all good TV shows do in this case and set up a clip show with some older content just to rehash it and feed the algorithm. So feel free to sit down and reminisce or relive the horrors depending on which video it is, and hopefully you enjoy or at least don't get too depressed by it. And if you see me floating around, feel free to say hi. Recommend a good place for finding a bacon and egg pie. That's my mission, I think, for this particular journey, is to find the best bacon and egg pie in at least the North Island. We'll see what we can do on that one. Anyway, enjoy this particular piece of recycled content. I suppose it's good for the environment if I'm recycling this way. I don't know. Enjoy. Hello there. Media bias is a term that gets thrown around a lot by people who aren't happy with how mainstream media post content and feel that it's against whatever it is that they see themselves as, if it's left-leaning or right-leaning, and therefore the bias of the media is the opposite of that. Which is a fascinating thing to watch because it shows that people don't really understand media bias. What they actually like is people not giving them opinions or information that contradict anything about them. For more on that, check out the cognitive dissonance video that came out last week. Media bias, though, is a lot more complicated than that, and there's a whole bunch of factors that come into play. Like, what's the difference between perspective and bias when it comes to the media that we're ingesting? So, we're going to dig in a little bit and see if we can get to the bottom of this and explain to you what media bias actually is, and how you can spot it, and where New Zealand media kind of lies on the spectrum, because there is no way our media is not biased. So let's start with perspective. Every reporter brings an individual perspective to the table with what it is that they're creating. They might be a business reporter or an entertainment reporter or a sports reporter. Their perspective is what tells the story. But when that's put together in a collection with other media, how it is spun, how it's promoted, the text and language that they use with things like headlines or promotion, that's where you're going to find your media bias. We tend to think of our media bias in really binary terms. It's either left wing or right wing. But in reality, there's a whole bunch of different types of biases that come into play. There's coverage bias, where the media choose to report negative news about an individual party or a specific ideology. There's gatekeeping bias, where they're really selective about the information that goes out there. There's a statement bias, which is when media is heavily slanted towards one particular perspective. There's bias around advertising, there's bias around concision, content, corporate decision making, mainstream media bias, partisan bias, sensationalism, structural bias, false balance, undue weight, speculative content, false timeliness, ventriloquism, and a demographic bias. There's a whole bunch of little factors that come into play with this. And to be fair, it can be broken down quite often into left versus right, but it is far more nuanced than that. But for the purpose of this video, so it doesn't go on for 16 hours, we're going to be focusing on left and right wing bias within New Zealand media, so you can sort of see where our media sits and the type of bias that it is that creates this left and right wing ideology in the presentation that it makes. If we have a look at both left-wing and right-wing ideologies and how it comes out in the media, there's two factors to both of them that are really defining. For your left-wing media, it's about communal responsibility and it's about progressive change. For your right-wing media, it's about individual responsibility and about maintaining the status quo. If you break it down like that, it's pretty easy to see where on the spectrum a lot of our content comes from. But let me give you some examples to sort of show you what it's like. So let's start with something that's really blatantly obvious. Right-wing media. This is the platform, which is as right as you can get before you start hitting into that alt-right Nazi-esque media that you find on something like Counterspin. And if you ever look at the media articles, which in here are all opinion pieces, there's a really strong theme of everything is terrible that the government is suggesting, let's not change a thing, it's all about you as an individual. In terms of mainstream media in this country, the left end of the spectrum is very much the spin-off, where their media articles are more about communal activity, communal change, and societal change moving forward in a progressive way. And you can definitely see the difference in the way that they frame their content that they put out there and the way that they're looking at making sure people engage with it. There's also complicating factors around who actually owns our media in this country. For example, the New Zealand Herald and News Talk ZB are the same company and they use each other's platform to cross-promote. But they try and make sure that they have very different sort of stances, left to right wing. Although they are both right wing, one is just a lot more to the right than the other. Can you guess which one it is? Shocker, it's the one that promotes individual ideologies and very much goes on the attack against the government. As we get more adept to media coming across different platforms, it's no longer just a newspaper or just on television or just on radio. We kind of see a mix as well as to how media is presenting information, but that doesn't mean that their ideologies change. And when it comes to our broadcast media, our two main channels, they've got very specific ideologies. One is definitely more right-wing than the other. And the difference here is actually private advertisers versus public funding. A publicly funded model, research has shown, has a better chance of providing a more even distribution of information and therefore a much less biased piece of news going out versus a private organisation. So when you have a look at these two here, you can tell basically which one is a private organisation there to make money and which one is there to work in the public good in some shape, way or form. But again, they both tend to have a bit of a right-wing bias to them. Me, the one I find the most fascinating, to be honest, is Stuff, because it feels like a much more centrist, balanced type of news presentation. But the opinion pieces tend to be all over the show with a bit more of a leaning towards the right wing with their political stuff, mostly because we know that their political editor who does their opinion pieces on politics and analysis is not a supporter of the government. That comes through with his bias. At the same time though, looking at the media that they're putting out around news, they tend to focus more on individual responsibility than they do on communal responsibility. But they've tried to change that with things like pointy, looking specifically at issues around Māoridom. They've tried really hard to pull back on things like misinformation and disinformation by not allowing information to go out on social media channels. So it's a really interesting balance to find there, but it still leans to the right. In fact, it's possibly a little bit more right-leaning than TVNZ is. So there you have it. Our media is biased. All media everywhere in the world is actually kind of biased. But the way that you can tell whether or not what you're looking at is a right or left-leaning bias is whether or not it's putting forward a case for communal responsibility and progressive change, or whether or not it's arguing against those and arguing more for individual responsibility and maintaining the status quo. What it does highlight, though, for me personally, is that people who sit there and bitch about the government media rescue fund obviously playing into how biased the media is for or against the government, don't seem to understand how these biases work. It's just absolute bullshit to make them feel better about not agreeing with something that they see in the media. What we've seen through research here and around the world is that properly funded public media tends to get you a much less bias and a much more even spread of information that's been put out that's going to be a lot more reflective of what people are actually after. But when it comes to privatized media, which is what we deal with today, that's not necessary.